At the beginning of this story, a boy named Phil appeared in an unpaved, desert-like area accompanied by some workers carrying axes. Phil then used his magical ability to pave the road so everyone could walk on it and begin work. After making sure everything was in order, he told his assistant, Rodri, that he was going home and then used teleportation magic, returning exhausted to his residence, where he was greeted by a group of girls. The girls noticed that Phil's relationship with Rodri seemed reversed. As if Phil were the employee, Phil replied that no matter how high he had climbed, he still felt like an employee. He then realized that he still hadn't adjusted to his new life, even after 10 years, and decided to go to his room. 10 years earlier, a young man dressed in formal clothes was lying on his sofa at home, feeling tired from the hard work and almost falling asleep right there. But he resisted and prepared his own dinner. After cooking, he sat down at the table to eat, but he couldn't resist falling asleep and fell asleep sitting in front of the food. When he woke up, he realized he was in front of a different plate, on a different table, and was surprised by the size of his small hand. He looked at the reflection in one of the plates and saw that he looked like a small child and was dressed in different clothes. His surprise increased when he looked around and found many people gathered as if at a wedding. He touched the food with his finger to confirm it wasn't just an illusion and concluded that it seemed like a realistic dream. Despite this, he wanted to quickly return to reality. He closed his eyes, but he couldn't return to normal. At that moment, someone interrupted him and asked him to greet the guests. This person led him to a group of visitors and told everyone that he was his youngest son and asked him to introduce himself. The boy felt nervous because he didn't know who he was or where he was. He looked at the guests and was about to say something when he was interrupted by a young man named Eric, who thanked everyone for coming to his older brother Kurt's wedding. Then Eric approached the boy and told everyone that he was his younger brother named Phil Baumeister. The boy realized that this would be his new name in that world and decided to follow what was happening until the end. He returned to the table with Eric and was even more confused to be surrounded by adults. Phil was surprised to discover he was only 5 years old and asked what was happening. Eric explained that they were at his brother Kurt's wedding to his wife Emmy and surprised Phil by telling him they belonged to a noble family. Afterward, Phil walked to the main hall and was impressed by everything he saw. Despite the strangeness, he felt somewhat reassured because everyone spoke the same language as him and realized that his family had great prestige to hold such a grand ceremony. He then sat down and ate his meal with satisfaction, without thinking much about what had happened, as if hunger overwhelmed everything else. The next day, Phil sat down to breakfast and was astonished to find only a plate of dry bread and watery soup before him, and he noticed that everyone in the family was eating the same thing. When he looked around, he realized that the house was very old and the furniture was worn. He asked about his brother Eric, and his mother replied that he had gone fishing. Phil waited for his brother to return and took the opportunity to inquire about the family's situation, being shocked when Eric told him they were poor despite Kurt's lavish wedding. Phil thought they might be poor, but they were still noble and must have some privilege. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another brother named Hamlet, and he was surprised to discover he had another brother, realizing he was the fourth son in the family line. Soon after, he met another brother named Paul returning from work. Then Herman and Eric mentioned that brothers Walter and Carl had not attended the wedding, and Phil was shocked to realize he was the eighth son of an impoverished noble family. Upon examining the map of that new world, he discovered he lived in a rural area called Baumeister Knighthood with only 800 inhabitants. He felt frustrated with his new, miserable life as the eighth son of a family without resources. Soon after, Phil saw his mother saying goodbye to Eric and the other brothers and ran to them to ask where they were going. Eric explained that they had already decided to leave home after Kurt's wedding, but that Phil would stay because he was still a child. He told them they could stay and inherit the land, but the brothers replied that they were poor and had no rights. Instead of dividing the land, they would give up their rights in exchange for a payment from Kurt, so that the entire estate would go to him and the others would cease to be nobles. Phil became furious and asked how they would live without the title. They explained that Herman had married into a subfamily to secure his position, and that the others would try their luck in the capital according to their abilities. Eric warned Phil not to be lazy, otherwise he would regret it later. Then they all left, and Phil bid them a warm farewell, as if he had many memories with them, even though he had only met them the day before. Afterward, he went to the house's library and began searching for a useful book until he dropped a crystal and some papers. He picked up the papers and discovered that the crystal was used to measure a person's magical efficiency. Phil didn't immediately believe magic was real in that world, but he realized it wasn't a joke when he read that everyone possesses mana, though only 1 in 1,000 has enough mana to cast spells. Phil placed the crystal on the table and decided to experiment out of curiosity. When nothing happened, he thought it was just a joke and walked away, but was surprised when the crystal glowed. He picked up the paper again and read that the crystal's brightness and colors indicated great magical efficiency and that the person should learn magic from experts. Phil couldn't believe his eyes and didn't realize he possessed extraordinary abilities, continuing to search for more proof among the books. But he found nothing about magic, only novels and poems, until his father entered the room. Phil asked if there were any other books anywhere, and was surprised when his father said he couldn't even read and asked him to go to the forest to get firewood. Phil went to the forest and tried to cast some spells on his own, but failed. At that moment, he was interrupted by a blonde man with a frightening appearance, reminiscent of Johan from the anime Monster. This man told Phil that he had sensed his magical prowess before and realized they were on the same wavelength. Phil was frightened and tried to defend himself with a twig he was holding, but the man took the twig from his hand and explained that there was no need to fear, as he was a magician too. When he threw the branch, he accidentally hit a large rock that fell on a wild boar. The animal spotted them and began chasing them, sending Phil running in fright. As the boar climbed the hill, the wizard held Phil back and told him he needed to visualize his magic in order to use it. He asked him to visualize wind magic, but Phil was terrified and couldn't understand. The wizard then explained that he should accept the mana within himself and allow the energy to course through his body. Once he did, Phil was amazed at the magical force that repelled the boar's attack, and the wizard told him he had used his first spell. The man then cast his own magic and hurled the boar away, knocking down trees until the animal fell motionless to the ground. The wizard then introduced himself and said his name was Alfred Rainford, former court wizard of the Duchy of Blickreader, and that he would teach Phil magic. They sat down for a drink, and Phil noticed Alfred sucking on the liquid he had hidden in his sleeve. Phil asked why he wanted to teach magic if there was no money to pay, and Alfred explained that he wasn't looking for money, just a disciple to pass on his knowledge. Phil was thrilled with the idea and declared that he would do anything to learn, so Alfred asked him to keep it a secret and that they would begin training the next day. Phil asked why they needed to keep it a secret, and Alfred explained that if people discovered his ability, a dispute over the succession to the throne could arise, as some might consider him fit to rule in the future. Phil replied that this was impossible, as he was the 8th son in the family. Alfred then stated that magic held much more power than he imagined, and that it could indeed make him the legitimate heir and even the next ruler, but that it would be dangerous for a child like him, so it was best to keep everything secret for now. Then Phil returned home and sat down to lunch with his family, who had only soup and a small cup, and looked around as he thought about Alfred's words that he could become the ruler of the kingdom one day and achieve wealth. The next day, Phil began his first training with Alfred, who explained that they would practice amplitude adjustment, a technique in which a mage can match his mana amplitude with that of another mage who has a greater amplitude, making the two equal. Alfred held Phil's hand and asked him to visualize the mana distributed throughout their bodies. When Phil did so, he was surprised to see Alfred's mana. Alfred explained that a mage's maximum mana capacity is determined at birth and cannot be increased, but that it was possible to match and even surpass this range. Meanwhile, Phil's father entered the library and was surprised to see that the crystal had been moved. He remembered seeing Phil in the library the day before and laughed at the thought of his son trying to discover his magical abilities on his own. Over time, Phil was able to use fire and wind magic, even destroying several stones. Alfred approached and praised his quick learning, saying he could already cast some spells. Phil was grateful and replied that he wouldn't have been able to use even the basics of magic if he had trained alone. Soon after, he noticed Alfred carrying a basket, and Alfred explained that he had brought food and vegetables, as the family said he was supposed to go out to gather supplies. When he got home, his family was happy because they would have plenty of ingredients for dinner thanks to Phil's talent for gathering vegetables from the mountains. But Kurt was furious when he saw the praise Phil received. Phil was surprised when his father asked him about a vegetable that supposedly grew on the other side of the river, where there was no bridge, and insinuated that he had used magic to fly. In reality, his father was just joking, and everyone laughed at the joke, but Kurt took it seriously. Phil continued to train magic with Alfred until he learned to fly and capture birds using the wind, and together they even ate near a waterfall. Alfred advised him not to go too deep into the forest, as it was full full of monsters and also attracted greedy people seeking easy wealth. Afterward, Phil explained that he felt Kurt had been watching him lately, and Alfred thought he might have noticed his magical ability and was afraid of losing his inheritance rights. Phil replied that he had no desire to take over the government, as it seemed like a lot of work and would also create conflict with his brother. Alfred suggested he become an adventurer, since he had the ability to adapt, and Phil thought the idea was good and exciting, allowing him to explore the world around him. Suddenly, Alfred's arm revealed a strange strength that he had been trying to suppress without Phil's realization. That night, Phil told his father he wanted to become an adventurer and enter the Adventure Academy when he turned 12. Kurt was relieved to know he would be free of him and wouldn't have any obstacles. But his father explained that they didn't have the money to pay for the academy tuition, which made Phil nervous. The next day, Alfred explained that the Adventure Academy was in the city of Breakburg, a primarily commercial city that allowed children to sell what they collected. Phil considered raising the necessary money through trade. Alfred told him he should learn displacement magic because Breakburg was so far away. Alfred grabbed his arm and began to fly until they reached a high altitude, showing Phil the vast world before them. At night, Alfred continued to suffer from the invisible force suffocating him, but he managed to contain it in the end. A few days later, while supervising the training, he was told that the last day of instruction would be the following day. Phil was surprised by the sudden end to his training while still practicing flight magic. Alfred assured him that he just had to grasp the basics and he would be fine, but Phil was worried that he still couldn't control his magic effectively. During dinner, his father told him that they had seen a whispering dead in the forest, an undead creature that regains consciousness and has an almost human appearance. Phil was surprised to realize that Alfred fit all his father's descriptions, with pale skin and a cold body, and thought he was right to be afraid of him when he first saw him. His father continued, saying that these creatures become zombies after a few years and hunt humans to devour them. Worried about Alfred, Phil ran into the woods and, upon finding him, told him about the Whispering Dead and asked them to return home together. Alfred replied that it wasn't a lie, since he himself was the Whispering Dead, but Phil refused to believe him and insisted on taking him to the mansion. Alfred then confessed that he was indeed a Whispering Dead and explained that it had happened 5 years earlier, when the Duke's son contracted a rare disease. The Duke went with him to the enchanted forest in search of a cure, and the two faced outnumbered monsters. Alfred expended all his mana and was defeated, which caused his death, but he transformed into a Whispering Dead because of the regret he carried. Alfred explained that a Whispering Dead disappears when its wish is fulfilled, and that his wish was to find someone to pass on the magic he had learned over 30 years. He revealed that he had lied when he met him, not saying he was a Whispering Dead so as not to frighten him. He then asked him to perform one last test to ensure he was the person he was looking for, and said he would teach him the sacred magic of purifying the undead. To Phil's surprise, Alfred asked him to destroy him using magic. He explained that he could not maintain his form for long with mana, and that he did not want to lose his mind and turn into a zombie. Alfred said that sacred magic is like the life force of beings and asked Phil to visualize it using mana. Alfred held his hand, and Phil began using his abilities until he felt the effect. But Phil didn't want to destroy his mentor and hesitated, until Alfred urged him to concentrate, remember everything he had learned in 2 weeks, and complete the task. Phil decided to be brave and end his master's suffering as a form of retribution, using his imagination and magical power to erase him from existence. He wept as he watched Alfred fade before his eyes until he was gone completely, and vowed to apply everything he learned and become a great magician. 7 years later, Phil was 12 and left his family's old, shabby mansion, heading for the Adventurers Academy in the city of Breakburg, where he managed to enroll. As he sat in class among his classmates, he remembered everything he'd gone through after Alfred's departure, and ended up isolating himself to avoid involvement in succession issues, which affected his communication skills despite his strong desire to have friends. When it was his turn to introduce himself, Phil simply gave his name, without mentioning his skills, which surprised his classmates. Everyone had some combat skill that could qualify them as future adventurers, but Phil felt frustrated by the stares from his classmates and thought he'd overreacted by revealing his last name. The teacher handed out forms, and Phil realized it was a platoon registration form. The teacher explained that starting the following month, they would begin training in groups called platoons. Afterward, Phil ate lunch alone in the cafeteria, feeling out of place, while a girl named Lena and her friend Luca commented on him. Luca said he'd heard of Phil's magical abilities, which could rival those of high-level adventurers. A boy named Erwin approached and explained that the magic teacher had decided there was nothing more to teach Phil and had given up training him. He suggested they join his team, thinking Phil always stood alone, watching his classmates. Luca thought it sounded like a good idea. At that moment, Phil decided to muster up the courage and try socializing with his classmates. He stood up and offered to try the mountain pepper powder in his food, but was interrupted by the laughter of another student who was talking to Luca and his friends, saying that no matter what they hunted, his team would be the winner in the end. Phil noticed his classmates were having fun and thought there was no need to disturb them. Everyone returned to class on time, and the teacher suggested that students who didn't receive an allowance from their families could work as fishermen for the academy and earn money, advising them to go in groups with their friends if they wanted to work. Lena and her friends were hesitant to approach Phil to convince him to join their group, while Erwin considered that Phil might want to challenge everyone by hunting alone, and suggested the trio compete with him to get his attention. Although the situation was simpler than that. A few days later, all the students went to the records office to deliver to the academy what they had gathered and hunted in the forest in exchange for money. Lena's team managed to capture 3 wild boars, and then everyone was surprised to see Phil approach the supervisor without any prey in his hands, until Phil handed him a magic bag that Alfred had entrusted to him before leaving. Everyone was shocked when Phil pulled out several fangs from his bag and placed them before the supervisor. One of the students gave up on trying to convince him to join his team because of the huge level difference between them, and the rest began to leave the room. The supervisor handed Phil a large cash reward, and he was delighted to have earned a considerable sum. He considered inviting his classmates to dinner on his own, but was surprised to turn around and find everyone had already left. That evening, Erwin sat with Lena and Luca and mentioned that his brother had already told him that he would not inherit the family rule, no matter how much he trained with the sword, because he was the 5th son. Lena replied that the situation was similar for them, while Luca explained that he was born with slightly more magical power than ordinary people, but was unable to use it. Luca explained that, without realizing it, he had become stronger than his father and brother and was eventually rejected, so he decided to train in secret. Lena was outraged and decided to hunt bigger prey next time so Phil would notice them, unaware that everything was simpler than it seemed and that Phil simply wanted a friend by his side. In the morning, the friends entered the forest in search of larger prey and were forced to advance deeper despite the professor's warning of the danger, until Lena heard wolves nearby. Meanwhile, Phil was on top of a hill, surveying the surroundings with his magical ability, when he spotted a group of wolves surrounded and decided to help, concluding they might be his academy classmates. Figuring he could win their sympathy, the wolves began their attack, and the young men managed to hold off some, until one wolf unexpectedly attacked Luca, and Erwin tried to protect her, injuring her arm. When the wolves closed in to devour them, Phil saved them at the last moment by forming a barrier of rocks around the group with his abilities. Erwin explained that the trio had acted that way so Phil would recognize them, and Phil realized his teammates were trying to lure him into the team, though it was simpler than they'd imagined. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the professor, who was shocked by Erwin's injury and told him it was only a minor scratch. The professor then informed the scholarship class that they had been invited to a reception organized and hosted by the Duke of Blakeritter. The class gathered and were excited to attend the reception and seize the opportunity to meet the Duke in person. One student interpreted the invitation as being to meet the only magician in the class, Phil, and dismissed the others as mere collectors, leaving some discouraged and others irritated. Luca, undeterred, suggested to his friends that they buy new clothes for the reception, but they resisted, preferring to wear plain, unadorned clothing. A few days later, a large number of members of the elite attended the Duke of Blakeritter's party, and everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves until a servant whispered to the host that Phil had arrived. The Duke immediately approached him, and Luca was surprised by the approach. The Duke ignored the others and approached Phil, introduced himself as Amadeus, and declared himself pleased to see him there, as Phil's family rarely attended social gatherings. On the other side, everyone was frustrated and disappointed at being ignored. The Duke asked to speak privately with Phil, who requested permission to take a few people with him, and Erwin, Lena, and Luca were surprised to hear him refer to them as members of his team. Soon after, everyone entered the palace, and Amadeus introduced the court magician named Branta. Phil was surprised to learn that Branta had been Alfred's mentor and heard the story of Alfred's death, as well as the report that Branta continued to track him even after he became a whispering dead. Amadeus Amadeus added that Branta was able to track the magical power of anyone he met over long distances. Branta explained that Alfred had told him about his wish and admitted that he never believed it would come true, as Alfred was among the 5 most powerful magicians on the continent, and it would be unlikely to find anyone worthy of being recognized as his disciple until Alfred vanished from existence 7 years ago. Branta concluded that the wizard Alfred recognized was Phil, as Phil carried his magic bag and came from the same region where Alfred ceased to exist. Amadeus questioned whether Phil had stolen the bag, and Branta clarified that no one could use it without Alfred transferring ownership. Phil affirmed that he was indeed Alfred's disciple and had purified him before he became a zombie, and Branta thanked him for allowing Alfred to depart in peace. Phil explained that the bag contained supplies belonging to the 2,000 soldiers who fought in the Enchanted Forest against the monsters. Luca then reflected with his friends that Phil had chosen to live alone to avoid the succession dispute and regretted their hasty judgment that he lived in a world alien to theirs. Phil joined the group after delivering the supplies to the Duke and Branta. Lena declared that she didn't feel up to sharing a team with him, while Erwin admitted that he had tried to use him to become stronger and improve his life. Phil explained that he had done the same with them when he took them to meet the Duke, fearing they would encounter someone of such standing alone. He stated that he wanted to be on the same team because he believed it would be fun even if difficulties arose. Everyone laughed, realizing that Phil only wanted to make friends. The Duke interrupted the conversation and announced that he would give Phil 20% of the value of the supplies as a reward. Everyone was surprised to learn that the total reward was equivalent to 1,000 gold pieces, and that Phil would also receive Alfred's personal belongings. A few months later, Phil traveled with his friends to the capital to attend his brother Eric's wedding, and Luca chose an elegant outfit to attract the attention of the nobles during the ceremony. Lena asked if there would be any nobles present and learned that Eric had married into a family of knights and that some nobles might be there. Branta tried to reassure the group by assuring them that a magical ship wouldn't fall from the sky, and everyone was startled by the appearance of a gigantic black cloud. Branta commented that a crash was possible if the ship were attacked by a massive dragon, and the dragon emerged from within the cloud. The passengers panicked upon seeing the dragon circling, reminding them that the route should not pass over monster-infested lands. A crew member tried to calm everyone, saying that it was merely an undead version of the dragon, and that Branta would deal with the threat. Meanwhile, Branta spoke with the captain and lieutenants and stated that he wouldn't be able to defeat the dragon because it was a whispering dead. He explained that the only way to defeat it was to purify it with holy magic, and that there was another wizard who could do it. When everyone looked at Phil, he declared that he couldn't, but Branta encouraged him, reminding him that Alfred could have easily solved this. Phil felt a responsibility to save everyone and agreed to face the dragon. Branta assured him he would protect the ship while he performed the purification. The ship's rear door opened, and Phil flew toward the dragon, which attacked as soon as it saw him, but was restrained by a magical barrier formed around Phil. Looking back, Phil saw Branta defending the ship with another barrier and decided to waste no time in eliminating the dragon quickly. The attacks continued, and Phil retreated until he reached a safe distance, at which point he managed to form the holy light and launched it with all his might at the dragon, overcoming the enemy's resistance to the purification. The dragon's body slowly began to fade until it disappeared completely. Branta drew Phil's attention to the use of the magic bag to collect the bones, and while collecting them, Phil noticed a red gem floating among the remains. Everyone celebrated the restored safety after Phil's victory. Phil and Branta then met a man named Arterio, who admired Phil's skills. Branta explained that Arterio had been his partner in his adventuring days and now headed a trading company in the capital. The next morning, the ship arrived in the capital, Statenburg, which Phil saw for the first time. Upon disembarking, Erwin suggested a tour of the city. Branta left, citing commitments, and asked Arterio to look after the group. Arterio thought Branta had dodged the issue, and Phil was still trying to understand the situation when they spotted a group of knights forming in front of them. One of the knights dismounted, approached, knelt to praise the dragon's defeat, and informed him that the king was waiting for him at the castle, inviting Phil to follow in the carriage. When they arrived at the castle, Phil was impressed by the grandeur of the place and heard from his friends that they were going to Eric's wedding. Surprised to be left alone with with Arterio. Upon entering the castle, Phil found the king sitting on the throne waiting for him alongside some important figures. He approached, still confused by everything that was happening. When Phil stood before the king next to Arterio, he imitated his companion's gesture and knelt to greet the sovereign. Seeing the king up close, he remained stunned, not fully comprehending his surroundings. The king announced that he would grant Phil the 6th degree of baronetcy as a reward. Noticing that he looked like a stiffened statue, Arterio led him to recite the oath he had taught him before entering the castle, and Phil declared that he would use the sword for the kingdom and its people. The king added that he would bestow upon him the Medal of the Twin Dragons. Around the same time, the friends were at Eric's house with Branta, and Branta commented that Phil would at least receive the title of baronet as a reward for his feat. Eric expressed joy at Phil's attained position and questioned whether this title would create a new branch within the family. Lena worried that Phil would abandon his adventuring career and leave them, but Branta explained that he would be just a toga-wearing nobleman with no landholdings in the capital. Phil then handed over the dragon bones, the stones collected in the magic bag, and the large red gem. Some leaders and officials debated the amount to be paid until an elder named Cardinal Heinhian intervened and suggested they grant Phil 150,000 gold pieces, so as not to embarrass themselves in front of him. Arterio realized they were trying to curry favor with Phil. While Heinhian sought to bring him closer to the church, Marshal Egger considered ways to use him to strengthen the army, and Commissioner Rockner focused on reducing the amount to be paid, which made Phil feel the weight of this new situation. That night, Phil left the castle with Arterio, and a man tried to impress him with acrobatics. Phil thought he was a street performer, but Arterio explained that the man actually wanted to be hired as a guard, which surprised Phil. Arterio reminded him that he was now a nobleman with a promising future for holding the Twin Dragons medal, a distinction no one had received in over 2 centuries, making him the center of attention for anyone seeking to take advantage of it. The next day, preparations for Eric's wedding began, and Phil arrived with his friends to introduce them to his brothers. He noticed their frowns, and Eric commented that the family had not yet offered a wedding gift, which would make everyone consider them impolite. Carl then delivered a letter from Kurt, written as if it had come from his wife's pen, asking Eric and Paul to pay for the gift because he was broke. This caused outrage, as they were not as wealthy as Kurt had imagined. Phil suggested offering a bouquet of flowers, but Paul explained that they should buy an expensive, valuable gift that reflected their position and that they could not borrow from the Duke, as they would not be able to pay it back. Phil, noticing the brothers' distress, took the initiative to help them with money and provided the gifts. Afterwards, everyone celebrated Eric and his wife's wedding, and Phil felt that being a nobleman could be a burden. At the end of the ceremony, Phil sat alone and sighed until Arterio approached and encouraged him to cheer up, handing him the Kumi Koji Phil had requested from a merchant because it was a hard-to-find product, which made Phil happy. Then Phil called his friends to the kitchen, and they all prepared food together using the Kumi Koji to aid fermentation. After adding the ingredients to the pot, Phil sped up the fermentation with his magic instead of waiting a whole year and managed to make miso. He sat down to eat with his friends, his brother, and his sister-in-law, feeling joy at this new phase of life with his family. The next day, Heinhian invited the noble wizard Phil to participate in the baptism at the church. Phil thanked him for the invitation and offered a simple gift. They chatted until Heinhian's granddaughter arrived to serve tea and introduced herself as Alyssa. When Phil watched her for a while, Heinhian realized that he had noticed his granddaughter's magical power and explained that she knew how to use healing magic to treat the wounded, that there were many nuns involved in charitable works in the church, and that she wanted her granddaughter to marry like an ordinary young woman. Phil commented that she was beautiful and that there would be competition for her hand, and lightly considered that he might want to participate. Heinhian asked if he really wanted the marriage, and Phil replied that it could only be an engagement, as he was still underage. Heinhian then proposed a proper wedding when they both came of age, as Alyssa was 12. Phil was surprised by the speed of the agreement, which sealed the engagement after a single meeting. After the visit, Heinhian reflected that perhaps he had been too insistent, but concluded that everything was going well thanks to the king's support, which prevented opposition from the Duke or Phil's family. Meanwhile, Phil was in his room, disguised as a clown so he could move around unrecognized, which spoke volumes about his situation after accepting the invitation to the baptism and returning engaged to Heinhein's granddaughter. Telling his friends, Luca assessed that Alyssa seemed perfect, combining lineage and character, but Phil wondered if 1 minute was enough to choose a life partner. Eric commented that he and his brothers hadn't met their wives before their wedding, and Phil was disappointed to notice the lack of romance among the nobles. After Eric and his wife helped him complete his disguise so he could go shopping without being recognized, Phil went to a store with Erwin and received strange and disapproving looks, as no one there knew the clown was an admired figure in his home world. Erwin suggested buying a souvenir for his fiancée and enjoying the outing. As they walked, Phil noticed again the acrobat who wanted to hire him. Catching eyes with the man, Phil feared being identified, but Erwin pointed out that the disguise protected him. His fear was confirmed when the man approached and recognized him by his last name, commenting that his outfit was funny, but his teeth gave him away. Phil realized the man had excellent intuition and considered giving him a chance. Phil asked him to keep his voice down to avoid making a fuss, but it was too late. People recognized him, and knights began asking to be accepted as followers. Finding himself surrounded on all sides, Phil used teleportation magic and escaped with Erwin. Back at the palace, he felt distressed at being limited by his own fame and unable to move freely. Eric suggested appointing a follower to reject unsuitable suitors, and Phil considered making Erwin that follower responsible for filtering approaches, rushing off to put the idea into practice. Phil then used teleportation and headed for the church. He appeared at the window of Heinhein's chamber, slipped, and fell before the cardinal saw him. Heinhein heard a noise outside, approached to check, and saw no one. Phil sighed with relief, but was startled when he heard Alyssa behind him. He quickly pulled her away from the window to avoid attracting his grandfather's attention, and mentioned that he had stopped by after buying something to eat together. Seeing the crushed sweet, he understood the situation and said he had actually gone to talk a little. The two sat on the roof of the church to discuss the morning's engagement, and Phil wanted to know how she felt. Alyssa calmly responded that she was pleased her grandfather had chosen to betroth the dragon slayer Baron Baronet, and that she was happy about it. Meanwhile, Lena and Luca were surprised upon returning from shopping to learn that Erwin had been hired by Phil as a follower, and Luca wished they were also appointed. Erwin used his authority to end the matter and angered them both by sarcastically saying he would make recommendations when Phil returned. Lena whispered to her friend that Erwin might treat them as inferiors if they came under his authority, and began to think of a way to surpass him. At that moment, Eric and his wife entered the room asking for help in the kitchen, and Erwin volunteered to help. Looking at the couple, Luca had the idea that she and Lena could become Phil's wives to position themselves above Erwin in the relationship hierarchy, sharing Phil's attention. Lena remembered that Alyssa was the most likely marriage candidate, and Luca reworked the plan to have them both become Phil's maids, which Lena considered a reasonable possibility. When Phil returned, Luca decided to try to seduce him into accepting her and Lena as maids, dancing awkwardly and unattractively toward him. As soon as Phil heard dinner was ready, he simply ignored her attempt and went out to eat. Luca then decided on plan B and shortened her dress to increase his chances of seduction. Lena felt encouraged, as Luca wouldn't be able to pursue Phil that way. Luca explained that her goal was to become his maid, open a school to teach magic, and gain her family's recognition. Lena felt more confident and considered trying too. Meanwhile, Phil was listening to their commotion outside the mansion when he received an invitation from one of Heinhein's servants to dine with Eliz the following evening. The next day, at dinner time, Phil and Eliz sat at the table for a private meeting under the watchful eye of the butler, but they spent the entire day talking in silence, even though it was considered their first date. Phil considered leaving after dinner, but the butler suggested he give her a gift to mark the occasion, a coral fish. Phil hated seafood. Afterward, he accompanied them to a jewelry store to buy an engagement ring, and discovered that rings ranged from 10 to 50 gold pieces, equivalent to millions in Japanese currency. Eliz approached and told him he shouldn't spend so much on something so expensive, and Phil thought she was right. However, he explained that he had received a good reward for defeating the dragon and collecting its bones, and that he didn't care much about money. It was then that he noticed a ring containing part of the immense red stone and decided to buy it, thinking it would be special to her. The shock came when the salesman revealed the price was 300 gold pieces, but Phil bought it anyway, and Eliz watched in surprise. On the way back, Eliz mentioned that the salesman had explained that the ring could store great magical power, as it was made of enchanted stones, and she felt Phil had bought it for her to wear in the future. Phil denied this, saying he simply thought it would look nice on her and that he didn't know about the magic stone. He then explained that he had always felt pressured when people called him a hero or a dragon slayer until he met her, and that he learned she was called a saint, which relieved him somewhat. They decided to test the ring, as the salesman had claimed it would glow when someone used magic on it. As soon as Phil did, an intense force surged toward the roof of the carriage as if opening a portal to another world, leaving Phil in awe of the spectacle. Afterward, Heinian asked the servant what he thought of Phil, and was told he was a difficult young man to understand, treating Eliz like an ordinary girl rather than the saint everyone revered, making it impossible to guess what was going on in her mind. The next day, Erwin inquired about Lena and Luca's plan to become Phil's servants, and Luca said they would resume their attempts at seduction when they returned to Preachburg. Just then, Eliz arrived at the castle, and Eric mentioned that she had come to visit Phil. Embarrassed, Eliz admitted she wanted to inquire about his personality and understand what kind of young man he was. Meanwhile, Phil was at the castle with Branta when the king surprised him with an order to hunt another dragon. Phil reluctantly accepted and felt like a servant of the king. One of the knights explained the region where the dragon lived and added that eliminating it would allow for development and solve the capital's food shortage. Phil was shocked to realize that only he and Branta would undertake the mission. Soon, a huge man named Armstrong entered the room, excited to participate, and announced to the king that they would leave immediately. They flew out of the castle and headed for the designated area. Armstrong took the lead and explained that they would first pass through the military border zone to plan and prepare for the offensive. Days later, Eric told Phil's friends that he had received a message from the palace, informing him that Phil would stay longer than expected, as, after eliminating the dragon, he was to exterminate the monsters in the region to prevent future attacks on the capital. Lena was surprised to hear that a nobleman had no army, but Eric explained that Phil was just a nobleman in a toga, landless, and that was why he had been chosen, as completing the mission would reward him only with money and medals, without having to cede any of the kingdom's lands. Their conversation was interrupted by Rodrigue, who was still performing acrobatics outside the gate, and Luca realized they had all gone to enlist in Phil's army. So Eric asked Erwin to take over as Phil's subordinate, but he hesitated at the sudden responsibility. Eric assured him he would help him, and that the position would be in name only. The friends then formed a makeshift army and set out into the wilderness. That night, midway through the journey, they pitched tents and slept until the next morning. While Erwin felt the excitement of his first battle alongside his companions, when they asked about Phil, they learned he was camped near the dragon's cave, ready to attack it at dawn. At sunrise, Phil advanced to the lair with Branta and Armstrong and was awed by the dragon's colossal size. Armstrong summoned his magical armor and raised his iron hammer to fight, initiating a series of attacks. To Phil's surprise, Armstrong wielded magic capable of converting magical energy into physical form, in addition to possessing great defensive strength, allowing him to face the dragon alone. The dragon tried to return to its lair and hide, but Armstrong caught up with it and grabbed its tail before it escaped. Phil began gathering magical power, still unsure if Armstrong would actually need it. Branta explained that the armor consumed a lot of energy and that Armstrong wouldn't last long. When the moment arrived, Armstrong asked Phil to deliver the final blow, and he unleashed all his magical power against the dragon. Meanwhile, Eliz was having breakfast with her friends when a soldier entered with the news that Phil and the others had defeated the dragon. Phil stored the body in the magic bag, even though there was no official reward. Branta explained that selling the dragon's parts would yield more than any prize. Armstrong then warned that the real problems were just beginning and that it was time to face the hard work. But Phil believed there was nothing more terrifying than a dragon. Branta surprised him by announcing that they would face countless monsters and that he would experience what Alfred had experienced in the Battle of the Enchanted Forest. Meanwhile, Eliz tended to the wounded in the camps, as the soldiers had joined Phil and the others in exterminating the monsters, unaware of their enormous numbers. As time passed, the number of wounded grew in the priest's tents until Eliz exhausted her magical strength. Then she remembered the ring that contained the stone capable of storing vast amounts of energy. That night, already exhausted, she sat feeling the weight of having treated so many wounded, until a soldier approached, praising Phil's skills and saying that everyone had survived until that moment thanks to him. Eliz recalled the conversation in the carriage, when Phil had confessed to feeling pressured whenever they called him a hero or a dragon slayer, believing himself unworthy. This motivated her to continue treating the wounded with all her might night so that his sacrifice would not be in vain. And so she cared for everyone until the next morning. Soon, news arrived that the extermination forces had returned victorious from the front. Eliz was startled to hear that Phil was injured and ran to him, exhausted, only to discover that the injured man was one of her brothers, while Phil was standing just behind, unharmed, overcome by fatigue and worry. She fainted. When she regained consciousness, she found herself lying under the shade of a large tree, with Phil at her side. He told her he had heard about her dedication in the medical camps and praised her efforts, repeating words he had heard from the soldiers. At that moment, Armstrong rushed in and ran to Eliz to check on her condition, realizing it was his niece. Phil was astonished when Branta confirmed the information. Upon returning, Phil was surprised to see that a portrait had been painted of him after his promotion and second medal. He asked Erwin to fetch the remaining luggage to prepare for their departure from Eric's palace, as they would remain in the capital by order of Duke Amadeus to continue their training. At that moment, Luca concluded that Phil and Eliz would move in together, and that the seduction plan would be unfeasible. However, they were surprised when Eliz said she thought Phil was engaged to them too, since they all lived together. Phil denied it and asked if she supported the idea of concubines, and Lena and Luca saw this as an opportunity to become his concubines. The two asked Phil and Eliz to marry, and Phil didn't object when Eliz gave her consent, resulting in a marriage with 3 girls by pure coincidence until that point. A few months later, Phil attended his brother Hamlet's wedding to a young woman from a knightly family, and one of the brothers commented that many families wanted to marry the Baummeisters to become related to Phil. Phil felt awkward and thought there might be other reasons, but his brother assured him that he was already an important figure in the community and that he needed to decide on the upcoming tournament. Phil was surprised when he heard about the competition. Eric explained that the kingdom held a martial arts tournament every 3 years and that they expected Phil to participate. Phil considered enrolling in the Mage Division, but was surprised to learn that there were only 4 divisions: fencing, archery, and hand-to-hand combat. His brother suggested the swordsmanship division so that Phil could demonstrate the swordsmanship befitting a nobleman, and Phil decided to reinforce his body with magic. Eric clarified that the use of magic was prohibited in the tournament, which left Phil frustrated and wishing for a cooking division. Erwin trained with Lena and Luca, but quickly exhausted his energy, attributing it to their training method over the previous 6 months, feeling he couldn't keep up with them. Then the trio noticed Phil approaching on his way to the church to meet Cardinal Heinhian. When everyone returned home, Branta surprised them by asking them to participate in the tournament as Phil's followers and explaining that they would only need to advance through the qualifiers. Although Lena and Luca considered it nearly impossible to progress without magic, Branta warned that an immediate elimination would embarrass Phil, so the two gathered their courage and decided to train without resorting to spells. Erwin believed he didn't have much to lose even if he failed, and Branta wanted to know if he understood that he might be separated from the group. Branta explained that they would all turn 15 in 2 years and become official adventurers, and it was natural to dismiss anyone who didn't put in the effort until then. Erwin replied that he felt connected to his teammates and that this would not happen, but Branta asked him not to be naive, said that he had already changed teams a few times, and warned him not to become a burden to his teammates, which left Erwin apprehensive. That evening, everyone had dinner together, and Lena asked if Phil would participate in the tournament. Phil said he'd been gathering information and had heard that the winner of the last 2 editions, a royal knight named Varen, wouldn't compete that year to train the new generation, which would make the competitions less difficult. Then he changed the subject and asked them to talk about the formation of the adventure team. Erwin became tense, so Phil said he'd met with Cardinal Heinhian for this reason and had decided to include Eliz on the team. Erwin sighed with relief at not being removed, and everyone welcomed her happily. Phil was pleased to see his friends welcoming Eliz and felt he could focus on the tournament, but he was surprised by Erwin's sudden enthusiasm. He promised to work hard to win and began training beyond his usual level. Phil couldn't keep up, maintaining an exaggerated excitement at the thought of victory while thinking about how he needed to achieve it. Phil, on the other hand, didn't perform well in anything other than magic and could barely wield a sword, displaying far inferior physical fitness to his friends. That night, he returned home and lay down on the couch while the others continued training, with Eliz watching through the window. The next day, Erwin noticed his hand bleeding from sword training, but his friends believed he would do well in the tournament. Everyone was immediately shocked when the king ordered Varen to participate in that tournament to serve as a role model for the new generation and an obstacle to overcome. Disappointed, Erwin retreated to his room and lay down, dejected. Luca asked if he would give up just because he knew Varen would compete, and Erwin replied that he had seen many impressive fights from him, and that it was no wonder he led the Royal Knights. Lena tried to cheer him up by saying they didn't see him as an obstacle, but Erwin asserted that those born with magic wouldn't understand what he felt, so his friends gave him some time. The next day, Erwin went to the lobby and found Phil sitting alone. He approached to ask if he would be kicked off the team if he couldn't win any fights, but Phil was asleep on the couch. When he woke up, Phil mentioned that Eliz was apprehensive about joining the team. Erwin assured them that her healing magic would be a great help, but Phil explained that Eliz was concerned about her own fitness, as she didn't train like them, fearing she would one day become a burden, and that's why she had started practicing daily on her own. He then asked what Erwin meant, and, encouraged, Erwin declared that he would do his best to win. He went out to find Lena and Luca, apologized for what he had said the day before, and heard that they would also dedicate themselves to achieving results. The three returned to training with increased confidence. A few days later, the tournament began, and everyone warmed up for the fights, while Phil leaned against the wall and ended up dozing off. Armstrong hoped they would advance from the qualifiers. Eliz joined the group and handed them lunchboxes she had prepared. Phil's head hit the wall. He woke up with pain and realized his fight was about to begin. Upon reaching the ring, he was surprised to see Varen as his first opponent. Phil thought he would have trouble, but decided to fight with all he had, without worrying too much about victory or defeat. As soon as the bell rang, Varen rushed forward, struck Phil in the stomach with the hilt of his sword, and won in a single move. Branta and Armstrong were frustrated by the brief defeat and hoped they wouldn't need to console their friends anytime soon. Phil, despite the result, confidently stated that everyone would do well, as if he had tournament experience. Meanwhile, Erwin and the others gave their all and won the first matches in their divisions. Shortly after, Luca returned disappointed and reported that she had been eliminated in the semifinals of the qualifying round. Branta acknowledged that she had done well even without using magic. Lena, on the other hand, reached the final of the spear division and believed she would advance with a win, but she ran into Rodrigue, the famous acrobat. Lena was surprised by his defense, then suffered a sequence of quick attacks, managed to block most of them, and, when she tried to counterattack, Rodrigue parried with a single movement and surprised her with a lunge that made her lose her spear. Lena returned with her head down after the defeat and commented that Rodrigue wasn't just a street performer, having grown up in a family of merchants, and shared the information she had gathered. Phil, as usual, fell asleep and didn't hear. Meanwhile, Erwin won the matches and reached the finals of the swordsmanship division, but he felt a sudden pain in his arm. Turning around, he saw Varen approaching, signaling that he was waiting for the match. Back in his room, the tournament directors advised him to forfeit if he couldn't fight due to his injury, but Erwin refused and insisted on continuing, as he considered this victory essential to keeping his place on Phil's team. Luca mentioned that he had spent the night preparing lunch boxes, and when he opened his, Erwin found small figures carved into the food to encourage them. He regained his confidence and sense of belonging, ate some, and decided to keep fighting without backing down, so that Phil wouldn't be ridiculed. After the tournament, Erwin and Lena began training with Varen and the Spear Commander, and Phil was pleased that they would both be training under renowned leaders. Luca then explained that his master had offered to train the group together. Phil decided that the next 2 years would be dedicated to training and evolving until they became official adventurers. When he asked who would supervise the training, everyone was surprised by the sudden arrival of Armstrong, who announced that he would oversee their preparation from that moment on. 3 years later, Kurt was helping his father with the plowing and farming when his wife arrived with their young children and announced that a visitor was waiting for him at the mansion. Kurt became irritated when he realized that the matter involved Phil. He ignored the visitor, handed the envelope to his wife, and said he had nothing to discuss regarding his brother. Upon leaving, his wife opened the letter, read it, and was shocked to discover that Phil had died while exploring ancient ruins. In fact, Phil had become a young man after much arduous training and was ready for his first adventure as an adult. The friends read the guild's instructions after completing their registration as adventurers, and Lena found that their first task would be to hunt in the local area for a period of time. Phil, for his part, was happy to finally become an adventurer, free from the formal obligations of nobility, secure in the knowledge that no one would take away his freedom. Branta interrupted the celebration and informed them that the team had been given, by order of the king, a mission to investigate ancient ruins, and Phil realized that, deep down, little had changed. Afterward, everyone headed toward the the underground cavern with Branta as their guide. He explained that these dungeons had been discovered after the army's victory over Gregorland, and that the Adventurers Guild had sent some people to explore them, but none had returned, which led them to suspect the presence of a dragon. For this reason, the mission had been entrusted to them, and the team was given the name Well Done Dragon Hunters. Phil found it curious that his friends hid behind him, afraid the dragon would attack them and die on their first mission. Branta explained that he had cast a detector spell to detect creatures around them, and when he opened the portal, everyone approached a circle in the center. Erwin was growing bored with not having found anything yet, while Phil wondered about the bodies of the missing adventurers. Suddenly, Branta ordered them to leave the room, but before anyone could move, a strange force paralyzed them. He explained that it was a trap set by an ancient civilization of mages and urged them to prepare to fight at any moment, but disappeared before he could finish his sentence. Then everyone slowly began to disappear until Eliz was left alone, but soon she too disappeared, and the room was empty. The group reappeared in a place called the Inverted Pendulum. Branta explained that the trap magically transported victims underground, forcing them to return to the surface, or they would die. Luca thought it would be easy thanks to Phil's teleportation ability, but was shocked to hear he couldn't use it because he didn't know where he was. They noticed stairs behind them and decided to climb up the traditional way. Upon reaching the top, they found a dark corridor, and as they passed through it, they saw a large group of armed and armored soldiers. Soon, the door behind them closed, locking them in the corridor with these unknown enemies. The soldiers began to move, and Phil and his friends prepared to face them. Branta asked Phil and Eliz to provide support with wind and healing magic to limit the opponent's movements and treat their companions' injuries, so they all advanced, taking down the soldiers one by one, putting their skills acquired after intense training to the test, and managed to defeat them. Lena was then surprised to find the bodies of the missing adventurers. Luca heard footsteps coming from above and realized more enemies were approaching, so they decided to flee quickly before they were spotted. Meanwhile, the king spoke with Armstrong and expressed concern that 5 days had passed without news, especially after hearing rumors of the group's death. Rumors of Phil and his friends' deaths were also circulating in the church, but Heinhian was confident they would return alive soon. On the way, he encountered Commissioner Rockner, who questioned the source of such rumors. In fact, Rockner's younger brother was responsible for spreading the rumors, sending a henchman to deliver a message to Phil's older brother, Kurt, announcing his death, intending to incite the inheritance of the estate, hoping somehow the news would be confirmed. Meanwhile, Phil and his friends continued to face soldiers underground. He felt they shouldn't fight endlessly and expend so much energy, and while Eliz was talking to him, she noticed that Phil had fallen asleep on his shoulder from exhaustion. The situation dragged on for several days until they were exhausted. Erwin believed they might die at that rate and thought he couldn't leave until he defeated Varen in a fight. Eliz commented that she would regret it if they didn't all make it home alive. When they passed through a portal, they thought the worst was over. But as they tried to leave, they were surprised by the dragon, which attacked them as soon as it saw them. Branta erected a magical barrier to contain the attack. At that moment, they discovered that Lena had been wounded by an unknown soldier who had appeared behind them. The room suddenly lit up, and they realized they were in serious trouble, trapped between the dragon on one side and soldiers on the other, all already weakened after expending too much magical and physical energy. Eliz had to use the power stored in the ring to heal Lena's injuries, while Branta thought of a way to prevent the situation from worsening. Phil considered attacking the dragon directly, but Branta explained that its body was made of mithril and wouldn't be affected by spells. After some thought, Branta placed his hands on Phil's shoulders and transferred all his magical energy to him, attempting to resist the dragon's attack for a while. Soon, Branta weakened, and looking at Phil, he thought how much he resembled Alfred. Phil understood that everyone was in danger and decided to use his full power to protect them. Eliz decided to help him before his strength ran out. She approached and cast the spell known as the Light of Miracles, transferring energy to him to the limit. She fell unconscious after giving up the last of her strength, but Phil managed to counter the dragon's attack, counterattacked, and defeated the creature. After the victory, they noticed that the soldiers had stopped moving with the dragon's death. Erwin then turned and saw Phil unconscious next to Eliz. Shortly afterward, Phil regained consciousness and heard Lena and Luca whispering that Eliz didn't need to kiss him to transfer magical energy, and that she had probably taken advantage of the situation. Erwin interrupted the conversation and asked everyone to follow him so he could show them something important. After they left, Phil looked at Eliz fondly. When they had regained some strength, they went to find Branta, who told them he had discovered that the traps had been set by Count Eichelberg, who might have wanted to test human abilities. Luca soon appeared, calling them to see an astonishing discovery. They had found ancient airships, the origin of modern-day magical ships. Erwin pressed a button, and Phil was surprised to see a small portal open to the outside, which restored their hope as the sun shone again. Back in the capital, they reported the discoveries made in the secret cave to the king, who decided to buy them all and increase the reward paid by the Adventurers Guild. However, everyone was shocked when Commissioner Rockner announced that the individual reward would be 2 million gold pieces, but paid in installments over 20 years. Phil and his friends then decided to leave Breitberg and pursue new adventures. Armstrong accepted the decision and promised to find whoever had spread the rumors of their deaths. Phil was surprised to learn that everyone had believed his death, and Armstrong explained that the price of power and fame was to arouse envy and jealousy. Luca was saddened to realize that envy would only increase after news of the enormous reward. Selena suggested they challenge the syndicate responsible for the payments to reduce their share to avoid harassment, since they already received a large amount through Phil. When Armstrong asked where the deducted amount would go, everyone looked at Phil, intending to give him their share of the reward, but he refused, saying he was satisfied. Lena asked what Eliz would do with the prize, and she replied that she would give it all to Phil. Luca congratulated him on receiving 10 million gold pieces, and Phil realized that this would be yet another reason to be the target of hatred. Meanwhile, the legation officials were furious about the mission's success, and Rockner's younger brother saw this as an advantage, as he now knew all of Phil's enemies and began planning how to get rid of him. Later, Phil and his companions were having breakfast at the mansion, when Phil had the feeling someone was watching them through the window, but he saw no one. He considered hiring someone to look after the mansion after they left the capital, and everyone agreed they would need a strong and loyal person, as Phil was the target of some resentment and needed protection. They remembered Rodrigue, who had defeated Lena in the martial arts tournament, and thought it was a good idea because he still wanted to be part of the group despite having been ignored for the past 3 years. Phil realized that this time it was up to him to take the initiative and went looking for him to invite him to join their team. They made a birthday cake and went to meet Rodrigue to see if he would accept. Rodrigue was moved, cried with joy, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Phil noticed someone standing on the balcony of Rodrigue's house, watching them. It was a mysterious girl with pink hair, wearing a hood that hid her features, and she remained there, keeping watch while they were inside. After a while, Luca ran to the balcony, sensing someone spying on them. They suspected it might be the person behind the rumors of Phil's death. Rodrigue swore he'd find this person no matter what and advised Phil to leave town as soon as possible. But Phil thought there was still something he needed to do before leaving. Afterward, they headed to the magical civilization research laboratory to meet with the head researcher, Lucas Pickenpower, who greeted them cheerfully. Phil asked if there was a magic circle capable of summoning anything the user imagined. Lucas replied that it was still a prototype and would require a tremendous amount of magical energy, but that it could fulfill his request. Phil walked to the center of the circle and positioned himself. Lucas asked him to visualize exactly what he wanted to summon, so Phil tried to imagine teleporting something to them. A piece of underwear appeared in front of him, and one of the researchers quickly took it from him. Phil explained that his visualization had been distracted because Erwin had already mentioned this kind of thing, so he tried again, concentrated, and managed to materialize what he truly desired. The mysterious girl continued to watch from behind the trees until Phil used his teleportation ability, and they returned directly to their home, making it impossible for her to follow. She remained intrigued, trying to figure out Phil's plans. Meanwhile, Rodrigue investigated the origin of the rumors and kept watch on some suspicious commissioners until she saw Rockner's younger brother at a window, which seemed revealing. The mysterious girl then went to Phil's mansion and, looking through the window, realized they were organizing a grand party attended by several dignitaries to thank everyone who had helped him during his time in the capital. Phil presented what he had summoned with the magic circle and told everyone he had caught a huge northern tuna. Everyone was amazed by the size and appearance of the fish and wondered how to prepare it. He suggested they eat it with the soy sauce he had prepared, providing a unique experience. Rodrigue approached and spoke privately with Phil, revealing that the person responsible for the rumors of his death was Alice Rockner, the youngest brother. Phil was surprised, having never met him, but Rodrigue explained that he was only using him to try to remove his older brother from office. He also told him about the emissary Alice had sent to the camp with the false news of Phil's death, planning for Kurt's children to inherit the estate to strengthen his own position. Phil was furious to see his family involved, but Rodrigue assured him he had already taken action. That night, Alice discovered she had become the talk of the town after news of her involvement in the Denet incident spread. He was shocked when his wife entered and said that a palace messenger had arrived with a summons from the king. Rodrigue confided in Phil that he had spread a false rumor about Alice to counter the rumors against him, and that if questioned, they would claim ignorance of its origin, thus escaping punishment. Phil thanked him for finding the culprit. Rodrigue explained that it had only been an initial suspicion, based on Alice's character. Phil then discovered that Alice Rockner was Rodrigue's father. He was surprised to hear that he had never been recognized as a son, since his mother was the daughter of a simple merchant, and hadn't even been accepted as a concubine. At that moment, Eliz entered carrying a plate of tuna for Rodrigue. All the while, the mysterious girl was still lurking through the window, until she decided to enter the mansion. She knocked loudly on the door, alerting everyone, and then broke down. Everyone was shocked to see it was just a girl. She ran toward Phil and Rodrigue, and when Erwin tried to restrain her, she knocked him down with one swift move. Phil thought she was going to attack him, but was surprised when she simply took the plate of tuna and ate it all herself. Soon after, Marshal Edgar approached, and Phil wanted to know if he knew her. Edgar said she was his daughter, Velma E. Tolvin, and that he wanted to introduce her. Velma claimed she had been investigating Phil to see if anyone would be able to feed her enough, acting as if she were being adopted as a pet. Edgar explained that food was the most important thing in her life. Branta commented that she suffered from hero syndrome. Edgar added that she needed to compensate for the enormous energy she consumed daily with large amounts of food, which made her extremely voracious and very expensive to maintain. Phil felt forced to accept this new responsibility, while Lena and Luca were happy to meet Velma. Edgar then offered Phil the option of marrying her or taking her on as a bodyguard. Phil replied that he intended to return to Breitberg to begin hunting missions as a common adventurer, and that he wouldn't need such a powerful bodyguard. Edgar found his words strange and stated that he would take care of exterminating the monsters when he returned to the city. Meanwhile, Phil's family still believed he was dead due to the rumors, but were surprised to see him through the window, in front of the house, with his companions. Reunited, they drank tea with their relatives, and Phil felt nostalgic as he drank the same weak tea his poor family always prepared, while Branter recounted the story of the Battle of the Enchanted Forest and spoke of the deaths of the soldiers who fought in it, explaining that the fallen bodies had turned into zombies and that the Duke had ordered them to be purified before the situation worsened. Kurt was angered by the Duke's order to send troops back to the Enchanted Forest. Branta clarified that the visit was to discuss how to handle the monsters they would kill. Kurt replied that they would have to pay tribute since the forest was within their borders. Branta asked them to negotiate the fee. Kurt consulted Klaus, the village administrator, who said the normal fee would be 30%. Even so, Kurt decided to increase it to 50% to force them to leave. Herman tried to persuade him to reduce it in exchange for the soldiers' weapons and armor, but Kurt claimed he didn't care about the remains of poor, worthless soldiers, as funerals had already been held for them. Eliz then suggested holding new funerals after the purification. Kurt rudely rejected this, and Erwin couldn't stand his arrogance any longer and asked him to stop. Kurt retorted, calling him a barbarian. Phil tried to calm the situation by asking his father to begin formal negotiations, but Kurt took offense, understanding that until then the discussions had been informal. The visitors explained that they had come to speak with the Baumeister family patriarch. Kurt became even more irritated, considering the remarks of his younger brother's followers disrespectful. Soon after, he thought about the letter Rockner had given him and gathered the villagers. One of them asked if Phil had returned to purify the undead soldiers in the forest, and Kurt's assistant replied that no, that he had only come as an adventurer on a mission and would leave after completing it. Phil, on the other hand, wondered if Kurt had always despised him since childhood. Herman explained that the distrust had begun when Phil left the house, as Kurt feared losing his position as heir to the knighthood, and Phil replied that he had never intended to steal it. Luca questioned why Branta wasn't drinking that night and accused him of drinking all day. Then Herman's wife approached Phil and told him that she believed her grandfather had turned into a zombie in the forest, since he had been the head of the squires. Phil promised to find his remains and deliver them to her. Herman was overjoyed and wished that Phil would be the heir to the knighthood in Kurt's place. Lena realized they were facing a succession crisis, and Phil thought they should quickly finish the mission and leave the village. The next day, the adventurers began their mission to lure the zombies from the enchanted forest, trying to provoke them with a few phrases. Eliz asked how they managed to lure the zombies, and Branta explained that the creatures responded to provocations even though they weren't very intelligent. Then the sky began to change, taking on a reddish hue, while zombies appeared from all sides. At that moment, Eliz used purification magic, combining her own power with Phil's to extend the spell's reach. Branta began collecting the remains that fell from the purified undead, as any who tried to cross the spell's field disintegrated and dropped their weapons. Luca then noticed a zombie among the enemies that looked like a leader, and Phil realized it was the former Duke, commander of the army. After purifying a large number of undead, everyone continued their search for Herman's wife's grandfather, until they were surprised by a massive dragon that managed to cross the spell's field and land in the middle of the group. Everyone was surprised that the purification had no effect on it, even though it was an undead dragon. The dragon lunged at Velma, who severed the creature's head with a single blow of her axe. Eliz informed her that the purification would work, but it would take longer to complete on that type of target. They soon noticed more dead monsters approaching, some able to cross the spell's field. The adventurers continued fighting those who managed to penetrate the barrier until they had completed the purification of many soldiers and creatures. Then Herman's wife's grandfather appeared before them. Phil and Eliz approached and were surprised to notice that he had transformed into a lick and was still able to speak. He wanted to know about his granddaughter, and Phil explained that she was married and leading a happy life. The grandfather lowered his weapon and allowed Eliz to purify him so he could rest in peace. Afterward, everyone collected his remains and handed them over to his granddaughter. Kurt then ordered the villagers to deliver all their rusty armor and broken swords to the blacksmith Eichert. One of the villagers argued that they didn't have their sons' bodies to bury and preferred to keep the armor and weapons as souvenirs. Kurt countered by saying that the village suffered from a lack of iron and that the material would be reused for local development. Phil intervened and challenged the decision, hearing from Kurt that he was the heir to the village government and that someone of lower rank had no right to oppose his orders. Phil then handed over a large block of iron so that the people could keep their sons' belongings. Kurt was irritated at having the argument deflated, but decided to wait until Phil and his companions left the village. When everyone returned to the Duke with the unidentified remains, Phil thought the mission was over and that he could finally manage the family village. He was surprised, however, by the Duke's order to take hunting missions in the enchanted forest and the wilderness within the village's territory. Branta suggested the group stay for a while. They then went to Administrator Klaus and informed him that they would remain until the Duke identified the owners of the unidentified remains, a process that could take a considerable amount of time. The next day, Eliz led the funerals and helped the villagers with prayers. Erwin asked why she was leading the ceremonies, and Phil explained that the village priestess was too elderly for the task. One of the villagers expressed displeasure when Kurt didn't attend the funeral. That evening, everyone had dinner with the locals, and Phil found it strange that Branta refused wine in the village. Soon after, he saw Kurt's wife and children go to the memorial and say their prayers. Phil approached, and the children were delighted to see their uncle, known as the Dragon Slayer, and asked excited questions about the battle against the dragon. Meanwhile, Luca, Lena, and Erwin reenacted the fight against the bone dragon for the villagers. At the end, Phil presented his nephew with a watery sweet he had prepared for them. Branta took advantage of the distraction and wandered off to another place. When the celebration ended, Klaus called Phil aside and asked him to become the village heir, saying that this was everyone's wish, as they saw no future under Kurt's leadership. Phil tried to refuse to avoid conflict with his brother, stating that he wanted to continue living as an adventurer. Klaus then suggested that the lands be under Branta's administration. Phil was surprised by the administrator's knowledge of his subordinate, but Klaus assured him he would support him if he accepted the village rule. Phil reasoned that the royal court would not allow the succession that way. Klaus asserted that the court members didn't care about formalities and that this was precisely their goal. At this point, Branta interrupted and informed him that the court wanted Phil to become lord of his village, explaining that the palace wanted to develop the vast lands and profit for many years. The problem was the lack of capacity of the local rulers, all common people, including Kurt. Phil said they couldn't impose such an order on his father, but Branta observed that other leaders feared being replaced. The palace had apparently devised a plan to allow the transition without much friction, causing Kurt to lose control, and after Phil restrained him, they would remove his father from office out of responsibility for his son, leaving the seat vacant for Phil. He realized that he had been purposely sent to the village to provoke Kurt, using the cleansing of the forest as a plausible reason to bring him, and that when the people called for his succession, Kurt would lose his temper and try to drive him away. Phil asked to be briefed before moving forward with the plan, but Branta assured him he would proceed with or without his consent. Phil wanted to know what they would do if Kurt tried to eliminate him, and Branta assured him he wouldn't let him be easily dismissed while he was under his guard. Phil noticed that Branta had avoided drinking throughout their stay to keep an eye on him and protect him from any threats, and asked why the palace was so insistent on him ruling the lands. Branta said Phil was the most suitable person because he had enough money and resources to develop the region. Phil understood that all the generous rewards he had been receiving on missions would ultimately go toward improving the lands, and wondered if the palace was already implementing the plan. Branta commented that some of what he had said was deduction, but that the only certainty was that the time had come to raise the curtain and begin the show. Afterward, Phil grew pensive, worried about a succession dispute with his brother and fearful that it would all end in tragedy, while his friends tried to comfort him by telling him that he could continue his adventures even as ruler. At that moment, Herman entered to announce that there were visitors, and Phil left to greet Kurt's wife and children. He played with the children and performed small magic tricks. His friends concluded that what worries him most about the succession is the possibility of the two children losing their noble future and having to leave the village. And Klaus observed the scene from a distance. That evening, a group of villagers organized to go to Phil's mansion and present their demands, but were surprised when Phil, Herman, and Branta teleported before them. Herman asked them to explain the situation and heard that they wanted Phil as heir in Kurt's place. Herman said his brother would not accept. The villagers responded that they feared no punishment, complained that Kurt favored his neighbors and did not demand taxes from them, and begged Phil to take over the government. Phil asked for time to reflect. They warned him that the Duke was close to completing the identification of the remains, which would mean Phil's departure, but they were stunned when Phil said he didn't plan to leave the village after the examinations were complete, and they began to question each other about the source of this information. Branta noticed Klaus watching from afar and realized he was the one stirring up the villagers, so he approached and spoke about it. Klaus pretended not to know what was going on, but Branta accused him of inciting the villagers to demand Phil be the successor, describing it as pushing everyone to their deaths. Branta explained that the royal palace would not tolerate others acting in his place and warned him not to overreact. Klaus apologized, said he was just a simple village administrator, and withdrew before him. Before leaving, he advised him to be wary of Kurt's wife, who was watching the scene through the window. Kurt's wife then went to her husband's office, but found a group gathered in front of him and discovered his intention to follow Phil and his companions discreetly, so as not to attract the villagers' attention. Meanwhile, Phil returned to the mansion after managing to calm the situation outside. Erwin advised him to make a decision quickly about governing the village before the villagers themselves insisted again. Phil asked what would happen to his brother if he took over, and Branta replied that the royal palace would eliminate Kurt after all the chaos he had caused. The next day, Phil decided to speak privately with Kurt and offered him part of the lands when his father retired and Kurt inherited the title, in exchange for helping him gain promotion to noble status and secure resources to develop the village. Kurt believed this was a trap for Phil to seize his lands and tore up the map in front of him, accusing him of wanting to steal his power and seize the position of ruler. Phil tried to warn him that there might be a revolt among the villagers, but Kurt interrupted him, expelling him from the palace. Frustrated by the failure of the conversation, Phil found his brother's wife and children outside and told her that he had expected failure, but that he had tried to reach a solution that was fair to everyone. Amai replied that she didn't care what others thought as long as she could protect her children, and that she deliberately brought them closer to Phil to win his favor and maintain the family's noble status, willing to face any consequences. Back at the palace, Phil helped his friends prepare spices and told them of his decision to become ruler of the village. He explained that he could end up hurting many people by not following the royal palace's plan, and stated that he would need everyone's help when the time came. Eliz assured him they would always be by his side. Phil began selling magical condiments, known in our world as mayonnaise, to the villagers, while the others traded goods and clothing from Breitberg and the capital. The success was enormous, infuriating Kurt and his followers. A week later, his own men told him that the clientele had migrated to the shops of Phil and his companions. One of them suggested eliminating him, but Kurt refused, reminding them that they were facing a magician and that they would need to defeat him on merit. The next day, Kurt received news that his followers had betrayed him and allied themselves with Phil, as he had provided them with the necessary resources to go to the capital to perfect their crafts without relying on him. Thus, support for Kurt weakened until he was left alone, exactly as the palace desired, waiting for him to lose his mind. Phil and Rodrigue then went to an empty apartment purchased to protect Amai and the children during the village unrest. Rodrigue suggested they take Kurt to hide in the church, where the palace couldn't reach him. Phil asked how things were going at court, and Rodrigue explained that a growing number of people were wanting to meet with him, eyeing the rights to the remaining lands and the high revenue they could generate after development. Meanwhile, Alice had already sent a lackey to monitor the situation and handed him a horn to set the plan in motion. Kurt, in turn, yelled at his men for not attending the village meeting and became enraged when he realized they had all joined his brother. A follower of Alice then appeared, quipping that Kurt intended to get rid of Phil with only a dagger hidden under his hood. The man pulled a magic flute from his pocket and explained that it was the dragon flute, capable of eliminating Phil much more effectively. He also said that Alice regretted having provided false information and wanted to redeem herself by offering the artifact for free in exchange for facilitating future negotiations over the lands. When Kurt assumed power, Kurt agreed to cooperate. The next day, Branta sensed Kurt's presence and warned him that he was approaching, drawn by rumors that Phil had entered the Westerlands alone. Everyone was surprised to see him appear unaccompanied. Phil realized he was coming to challenge him and went to meet him alone to talk. But Kurt already knew his companions were after him and asked them to show themselves. He then began to mock all of his brother's achievements, including his attempt to take control of the lands. Branta was shocked to see the flute in his hands and explained that it had the power to summon all the dragons north of the Civ Mountains, something they would not resist. Erwin lamented the danger this would bring to everyone, but Kurt laughed, saying that after the dragons ravaged everything, he would take the estates and be celebrated as a greater hero than Phil. Phil was outraged by his brother's willingness to sacrifice his own family for power and influence, but Kurt warned him not to move. Content with a feeling of being in control, Branta tried to cast a spell to knock the flute from his hand, but failed. Kurt declared that the deaths of everyone Phil knew would be his fault before blowing the flute. Instead of dragons, ghosts emerged from underground, prompting Phil to approach, until Velma restrained him when she sensed the creatures emanating hatred. Branta then realized Kurt had been tricked, as the artifact was actually the Flute of Rancor, which absorbed malice from its surroundings to defeat enemies, but ultimately transformed its wielder into an undead being. Negative thoughts invaded Kurt, who continued to play, believing he would win, until he was consumed and transformed into a massive monster, overcome by hatred. Phil was horrified to see his brother lost to this corruption. Branta ordered him to use sacred magic to purify it, as Kurt had already died in the process. When the monster tried to attack them, Eliz created a barrier to contain it and decided to purify it, but Kurt's strength was too great for her to withstand alone. Phil regained his focus and asked her to amplify her power, as they had done in the Enchanted Forest. Together, they managed to purify the creature, which shattered into fragments, destroying the stone that imprisoned Kurt's body. Meanwhile, Eliz was organizing a grand celebration, hoping for good news, but Kurt's vengeful spirit invaded the hall and devoured everyone present, including Eliz Rockner. The next day, guards barricaded the gates after news of the death of Eliz and 12 nobles. Rodrigue realized that his own father was responsible for Kurt's fate and decided to seek revenge for deceiving him. Phil then learned that it would be difficult to bring Kurt's wife and children to the capital, as they were now seen as relatives of a criminal and would have great difficulty adapting to the community. He discovered that the family was living secretly with the second son of the house. Phil was confused by the fate of his brother's family, realizing that everyone looked at them with hostility and that they were unable to leave freely, and this made him feel like he had failed to save anyone despite being called a hero. Armstrong said he still had no results in his research into the flute's origin. Brantag commented that he had also been thinking about this for some time, but that he had spoken as if he were an ordinary man, urging Phil not to forget that he was a nobleman, no matter what. But Phil continued reflecting on his own life and how his social status affected him, and began to feel out of touch with reality, something he had been noticing more strongly recently. He confided in Eliz that he felt he hadn't fully accepted that world, and that he thought he was ready to live a normal life. She replied that he always gave his best and did so intelligently, encouraging him and affirming her confidence in his abilities. The next day, Phil went to the royal palace to be honored by the king for solving the accident at Baumeister village, receiving all the remaining lands there as a reward. The king then asked what he wanted as his personal prize. Phil requested the right to grant the title of nobility to 2 people of his choice, as there were many vacancies due to the incident with the Flute of Rancor. The king, however, was angered and said that the right to grant titles belonged to him alone, and everyone showed disapproval at Phil's bold request. Edgar took advantage of the situation and asked the king to grant him part of the remaining lands, claiming that someone with more administrative experience could develop them. He nominated Baron Mark, known as the kingdom's greatest developer. Rockner opposed Edgar's request because Mark was his relative. Duke Amadeus intervened, saying that there had been precedents in which the right to grant titles had been transferred, and that this should be taken into account. Edgar accused the Duke of trying to expand his faction by granting one of his subjects the right to distribute titles, and the discussion dragged on, causing chaos in the royal palace. Armstrong ordered silence and suggested that Phil withdraw his request, proposing that the king partially grant Edgar's request by giving him a small portion of the land to develop himself. However, the king decided to hand over all the lands to Phil to develop with his magical powers, and, to everyone's surprise, agreed to grant him the right to confer titles as well. Armstrong glanced sideways at Phil and winked discreetly, signaling that he had attempted to indirectly influence the king's decision. The king then granted him the 5th rank and the title of Count for developing the lands. Rockner was surprised to see that Phil had leapfrogged all the intermediate ranks and become a full-fledged count. Phil swore the oath of allegiance, and Armstrong commented that the king was aware of his indignation at the request and advised him to practice his expression better next time. Meanwhile, Phil decided that the 2 titles he had received would be given to Kurt's sons upon their 15th birthday. A few days later, he began developing the abandoned lands with the help of the workers, removing huge boulders from the terrain. He then decided to return home, leaving Erwin and Rodrigue to supervise the workers. Rodrigue asked him to also oversee the neighboring areas, as a church would be built there under the patronage of Hohenheim and lands belonging to Edgar, Rockner, and Duke Amadeus. Phil didn't object, as he owed them all gratitude for supporting the king's right to grant titles. He pulled from his pocket an imaginary drawing of the project he planned to build, a workshop for producing soy sauce. And that's the end of the story. Like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more videos.